Do you remember normal? It was a Monday morning commute. A playground with the kids. Normal was deciding between a booth or a table. But now, normal looks new. New ways to spend our time. New ways we interact with each other. New ways we experience God. Normal changed. Will you?
Hey everyone, glad you could join us today. I do want to wish a happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. Thank you for all you do. Today we are continuing our series entitled A New Normal as we look at some things that maybe we have learned through the course of this pandemic and this quarantine. And today we're going to look at a new normal in regards to our finances. And so I want to encourage you to turn to the book of 1 Timothy, and we're going to look at a few verses from 1 Timothy chapter 6. I have here on the table next to me some items that maybe you have in your house as well. There's a lot of things that we use on a regular basis, sometimes even daily in our homes, that have warning labels on them. For instance, I have this hand sanitizer, which is a new normal for us, using a hand sanitizer often. And the warning on this hand sanitizer says, for external use only, to be used on the hands, and warning, it is flammable. I have some carpet cleaner here that we use at our house because we have a new puppy, and that's become a new normal for us as well. And the warning on this carpet cleaner says, do not mix with other chemicals. And I have here hopefully something that all of us use on a daily basis, deodorant. Even deodorant has a warning label on it, and it says, warning, do not apply to broken skin. These things we use on a daily basis, and there's warning labels on them because if we use them the wrong way, can lead to danger and harm to us. However, there is something that you and I use in our life on a daily basis, but doesn't come with a warning label. And that is money. I have a quarter here, and nowhere on this quarter I see a warning label about how to use it. I have a $20 bill, and there's a picture of a president, and like all of our bills, there's landmarks on the backside, and there's a signature by the Treasury Secretary, but nowhere on any money, from a penny all the way to $100, do we see warning labels. However, money can get us into a lot of trouble. Now, I do want to have a disclaimer today because there is a notion that all pastors talk about is money and giving to the church, and in no way do I want that to come across today. But I can't help but talk about money because the way in which we use money and the danger that you and I can get into because of money is too great for me to ignore. Did you know in the Bible, in regards to prayer, there is 512 references to prayer. There are 402 references to faith. The Bible talks about heaven 551 times. And the Bible talks about money and possessions 822 times. God places a high priority on money, and even though our money may not have warning labels, God in His Word has given us warning labels when it comes to money. I think of people that I know that have gotten into serious trouble because of the way in which they used money. I know of people who have gotten in serious trouble because of the way in which they got money. I know of people who are in serious financial trouble because of how they view money in their lives. And so I want to talk to you today about how you can have financial margin in your life. We've been talking about margin, and really how our new normal really brings margin into our lives. Before the pandemic and the quarantine, really, we didn't experience margin. And when everything seemed to stop, we kind of refocused, began to live with a new normal. And that new normal has margin. And I want to encourage you today to have financial margin. Remember, margin is that amount that's available beyond what is needed. And so as we think about financial margin, it's the amount of money that I have left at the end of the month. Many people say I have more month left at the end than money. Financial margin says I'm going to have more money at the end of the month. For instance, if you make $2,500 a month and you spend $2,000 a month, you have $500 of financial margin. If you make $2,500 a month and you spend $2,500 a month, you have no financial margin. And this is what I know about all of us, is that all of us live on a percentage of our income. Some people live on 75% of their income. Some people live on 85% of their income. Some live on 90% of their income. And there's a lot of people that have been living for a long time on 100% of their income. And there's some even that live above 100% of their income. And so I want to talk to you today about how you can experience financial margin. Wouldn't it be great to have that financial margin so that when something breaks down, you don't break down? Wouldn't it be great to have that financial margin? Because as we've talked about, as I've said for the last couple of weeks, when our margins decrease, our stress increases and our relations suffer as a result of lack of margin. And of anything else in our life, when our financial margins decrease, our stress skyrockets. And when our financial margin decreases, our relationships suffer. The number one cause of divorce in America today is money issues. Couples who do not experience that financial margin. So I want to give you a principle today that I believe if you put it into practice, you can enjoy great financial margins in your life. And so let's look here in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and I just want to talk to you about our old normal and our new normal. Our old normal was materialism. When we lived in this old normal, it was all about what we could purchase and what we could have. It was all about our possessions. And this is not new to us. In 1 Timothy, Paul is writing to his son in the faith, and Timothy is that pastor in the church of Ephesus, and he's kind of instructing Timothy on how to lead the people that God has entrusted into his care. And at the end of his letter to Timothy here, he talks about this issue of money. And we pick it up in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6. He says, "But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment." And that's the key word here. He says it's important for us to live godly lives, but godliness is of great gain when we learn to live with contentment. Contentment is that state of being in which you don't need anything else in your life. And I would dare say that contentment is not the result of increase in money and possessions. Contentment is a desire to live on less. That's why in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, Paul wrote these words. He said, "I have learned that whatever condition I find myself, that I've learned to be content." And there in the context, Paul's saying, I know what it was like to be rich. I know what it was like to be poor. I knew what it was like to have a lot of food. I knew what it was like to go hungry. And he said, whatever condition I found myself in, I have learned to be content. And that's what he writes here to Timothy. Godliness actually is a means of great gain when it's accompanied by contentment. And then in verse 7, he says, "For we brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either." He said, this is the reason why you and I should live with contentment, because there is nothing that we brought into this world, and there's nothing that we're going to take out of this world. And actually in the original language, when Paul wrote that verse, nothing was at the beginning of the sentence. It was there for emphasis. He wanted to remind He wanted to remind the people who were reading this that there's nothing you brought with you. There's nothing you're going to take with you. In verse 8, if we have food and covering and these things, we shall be content. What he's trying to say to us is he's saying, listen, you and I should learn to be content because we have our needs met, not because we achieve our wants. I think a lot of trouble that we get into as Americans when it comes to this issue of money and materialism is that many times we get confusion between our needs and our wants. We need food, we need clothing, we need shelter, but then we want things that sometimes we get confused in our mind and we make them needs as opposed to just wants. And this is what I have learned as I lived in this old normal of materialism, that there's one word that describes it. It's more. How many times have you said, or maybe you've heard somebody else say that, if I could just make $1,000 more a month, everything would be fine. Or if I could get a raise and I could just make $1 more per hour, then things would work out for me. And we have this insatiable desire for more. But what Paul is saying here, he's saying our contentment is not found in getting more. Our contentment is found in learning to live with less. Because if you look in verse 9, he says, those who want. Those who, the idea there was you put on blinders and you're blinded to everything else except for that one thing that you desire. He said, but those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. He says those who want to get rich, that's their main desire in life. He says what's going to happen is they're going to fall. And how are they going to fall? He says they're going to fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires. It's kind of like an animal. If you've ever seen animals that have been trapped, and what you set the trap and then you set bait in the trap. And what happens is that animal comes along and inside that trap is something they desire. And the moment they reach for that thing that they want, the trap snaps shut on them and they've been caught. And Paul warns, he said the same thing in our life, that when we are consumed by materialism, these things that we want, what happens is we reach out for them and then we get caught in the trap. And then what he says after that, many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. That word that Paul used there for plunge in the original Bible language is a word that was oftentimes used for ships that were sailing and started to sink and went down into the deep. He said when our desire is for more and we're consumed with materialism, he said what happens is we are going to find ourselves shipwrecked. Think about the marriages that have been shipwrecked because of money. Think about the Christian testimonies that have been shipwrecked because of a desire for more. Think about the lives that have been ruined because there was this desire for more. Think about the children who have been neglected by parents because their parents had this desire for more. And Paul says that we will plunge ourselves into ruin and destruction because of this desire for more. In Proverbs, it talks about this way. In Proverbs chapter 21, verse 20, it says, there is precious treasure and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man swallows it up. Notice what the writer of Proverbs said there. He didn't say that there's plenty in the house of the rich. No, he said there's plenty in the house of the wise, and it's the foolish who consume everything. And many of us have lived foolish lives in which we have consumed everything. And one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is our need for financial margin. How many stories did you hear about people that may have lost their jobs because of the pandemic and the quarantine? And we heard stories of people who said it's going to be hard for them because they're living paycheck to paycheck. We've heard stories of people who've been struggling to be able to buy food because of their lack of financial margin. And that's what Paul is saying here. He's saying, don't have a desire for more, but learn to live with contentment. And new normal, whereas our old normal was materialism, our new normal is generosity. What Paul goes on to talk about here is how you and I are to be generous. I meet people all the time and talk about this issue of money and generosity, and they'll say things like, oh, I know I should probably give more, but I don't have enough money. I really wish I could be more generous, but finances are so tight. And what they're saying is this. They're saying, I know, deep down inside, I know that I'm to be generous. Deep down inside, I want to be generous. But you know, I don't have any financial margin in my life. And because there is a lack of financial margin, the generosity gets squeezed out. And so he says here in verse 17, if you jump down to chapter 6, verse 17, he says, instruct those who are rich. He says, teach them, command them. Instruct those who are rich in this present world, hope on the uncertainty of riches. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but you know that if you live in America, you are rich in this present world. Because we are so much more wealthy than the rest of the world around us. And he says, because of that, do not be conceited. And number 2, don't fix your hope on the uncertainty of riches. He said, don't place your hope on something that can be here today and gone tomorrow. Because maybe you're just one layoff away from having no financial margin. Maybe you're just an injury away from not being able to go to work and losing your financial margin. Some people have learned that it can take just simply a pandemic and a quarantine that can throw the entire world off of its financial axis. He says, don't fix your hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Susie Orman, she is a financial expert, and she wrote a book one time entitled 9 Steps to Financial Freedom. And in that book, she tells a story about going to Mexico. She was traveling around some of the shops in Mexico, and she noticed that in the open-air market, there was a man who was selling parrots. And he had a number of parrots who were lined up, and they were just right there on their perches. They didn't fly away. And Susie came and asked the merchant, said, are the parrots' wings injured? And he said, no. He said, well, she asked, well, why do these parrots not fly away? Don't they know they can fly away? And this is what the merchant said. He said, I've trained them from a very early age to hold on to the perch. And they find their security in that perch. They don't realize that if they were to let go, that they would have the freedom to fly away. And she also then discovered that they can be untrained, that the merchant can train them to let go of the perch, and there they can find the freedom that they were created to enjoy. And in the same way, you and I, we look at the riches of this world and we believe that that's where our security rests, and we hold on to our money. We hold on to our possessions with closed fists because we think that that's where our security lies. But Paul says that's not it, because our riches are eternity. But he says, put your hope in God, who richly supplies all of these things so that you can enjoy it. But he doesn't stop there. He talks about this new normal of generosity with Timothy. And he says in verse 18, instruct them, command them, teach them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. He says in verse 18, be ready to share, be ready to be generous. And what Paul is saying to Timothy there, he's saying, teach your people to have financial margin in their lives. Not to live with materialism, but to live with generosity and have financial margin in their lives so that when the opportunities present themselves, they can be generous. They won't say, boy, I'd really like to give, but I can't. But what they will say is, I would love to give, and because I have financial margin, I'm going to be able to give. And then in verse 19, he says, storing up for themselves the treasures of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Paul says living a life with financial margin and generosity is what real life looks like. Remember, I told you that the good things in life live in the margins of life. And if you want to experience the good things of being generous, you've got to create financial margin in your life, because generosity lives in the margin of life. And so if you want to experience what Paul says here, take hold of that which is life indeed, it's going to require financial margin. So it is a mindset. You see, margin doesn't happen because we have an increase in wealth. It's a change of mindset. And this is the principle that I want to give you today, is to simplify your living so that you can multiply your giving. You see, financial margin is not the result of what I can accumulate. Financial margin is the result of the change of my lifestyle. Simplify your living so that you can multiply your giving. Most of the financial problems that we have is typically not from the lack of money. It's because of the lack of restraint in our lifestyles. So simplify your living so that you can multiply your giving. And I think there's a couple important things to keep in mind. Number one is that money needs to be viewed correctly. In chapter 6 of verse 10 that we skipped over here, but this is what Paul wrote to Timothy. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Now that is one verse that is commonly misquoted. Probably the most misquoted verse in the entire Bible, because a lot of people say money is the root of all evil. Money is an inanimate object. It can't be good or evil any more than a rock can be good or evil. What he says here is, he says the love of money is the root of all evil. And that can be somebody who has a lot of money, it can be somebody who has no money. It's the love of money that is the root of all sorts of evil. If you're going to have a change of mindset, if you're going to simplify your living so that you can multiply your giving, it's going to require you to view your money differently. And understand that integrity is better than income. That trust is better than treasures. That relationships are better than riches. And to really view money in the context in which God has designed it. And number two is not your money needs to be viewed correctly, but also that your money needs to be used correctly. When we think about using our money, our old normal was, I'm going to spend my money, and if I have any left, I'm going to save it. And if I have any left after that, then I'll give it, because we didn't have any financial margin. And because there was no margin, it squeezed out the giving. But Paul turns this upside down on its head. And he says, don't spend, save, give. Look at it from the other way and give, and then save, and then if you have any left over, spend. Rick Warren said it this way. He said, our money needs to be used for God, for others, and then for ourselves. And when we begin to view our money correctly and we begin to use our money correctly, then we are going to make the most important things most important in our life. Bobby Bowden, he was the long-time football coach for Florida State University. And he was a believer, and in college he played baseball. And Bobby Bowden told a story about one time he hit a home run. It went over the fence, first home run of his college career, and he started to round the bases, and he got to home plate, and all of his teammates were cheering and patting him on the back. And then he said he noticed something. He said the umpire gave the ball to the pitcher, or the catcher threw the ball back to the pitcher threw the ball to first base, and the umpire called Bobby Bowden out because he missed touching first base. And Bobby Bowden said this. He said, if you forget to touch first base, nothing else after that matters. And then he said this. And then he said, in the same way, if you do not honor the Lord first, nothing else matters. Even in the area of our finances, if we don't touch first base financially, it doesn't matter what we do after that. And so simplify your living so that you can multiply your giving. I want to give you just 3 simple steps that you can put into practice in your life so that you can begin to experience financial margin in your life and be able to give generously. Number 1 is to budget. We talked about this last week when we talked about our time and making sure we took care of the most important things first. And in the same way in our financial lives is that we need to budget our money. Because if we don't budget our money, at the end of the month, you're going to look back and wonder, where did all of my money go? And so one of the things that my family does, Beth and I, we have what's called the Every Dollar app. If you have a cell phone, you can go to your app store, just look for Every Dollar. And as long as you both sign in with the same username and password on both of your devices, both of you can look at your budget. Sit down together if you're married with your spouse. And if you got children, include your children in on this too so that you can teach them what it means. Because we've got to budget our money if we're going to use it correctly. Now, some people object and they say, well, I don't make enough money to budget. Or I live on commission and I don't know what my monthly income is going to be. I want to encourage you, don't just get rid of all the excuses and learn to budget, because when you budget, you know what can happen is now you can begin to budget in margin in your life financially. And when you begin to have margin financially in your life, you're going to experience your stress will decrease and your relationships are going to flourish. So budget. Number 2 is get out of debt. So many Americans today are living in debt. And the Bible's clear about this, that when we live in debt, that we become slave to the lender. But listen to what it says in Proverbs chapter 6. It says, beginning in verse 1, my son, if you have become surety for your neighbor, have given a pledge for a stranger, if you've taken out a loan, if you've gone into debt to somebody, if you've been snared with the words of your mouth, have been caught with the words of your mouth, do this then, my son, and deliver yourself. Since you have come into the hand of your neighbor, go humble yourself and importune your neighbor. Give no sleep to your eyes, no slumber to your eyelids. Deliver yourself like a gazelle from the hunter's hand, and like a bird from the hand of the fowler. Dave Ramsey, who's a financial guru, he says this. He says, when we determine to get out of debt, we need to do it with gazelle-like intensity. Because think about the lion that is chasing the gazelle. Right? The lion's chasing his lunch. The gazelle is running for his life. And in the same way, if we want to get out of debt, we've got to run from debt like our life depended upon it. And so when you begin to budget and you find yourself having some financial margin, then you take the extra pennies and dimes and dollars that you have and you pour it towards your debt. And work as hard as you can to get out of debt, because one of the biggest reasons Americans don't experience financial margin, the greatest reason Americans typically aren't generous, is because many times we're in such great debt. So live on a budget, get out of debt, and then number 3, give generously. We talk about the habits here at Hillside. Have daily devotions, attend church regularly, be a generous giver. That's the B in our habits, to be a generous giver, because we really believe that if you're going to be a committed follower of Jesus Christ, if you're going to be a disciple of Jesus, the disciples are generous givers. And so when you make your budget, the very first thing, and this is what I love about Dave Ramsey's Every Dollar app, is the first thing on the budget list. Right after you list all your income, the first thing is, how much are you going to be generous? And I want to encourage you to start with 10%. And as you begin to get more and more financial margin in your life, you can begin to give more and more and more and be a generous giver. D. James Kennedy one time told a story about Peter Marshall, who was the chaplain of the Senate. And Peter Marshall said that one day a man came to him and said, Dr. Marshall, I need you to pray for me because I've got a problem. And began to ask about what the problem was. And the man said, I used to make $20,000 a year. And I would tithe, I would give 10%. And so it was very easy for me to give $2,000 every year. But he says, I have a problem now. Now I don't make $20,000 a year. Now I make $500,000 a year. And tithing has become much more difficult. It's harder for me to give $50,000 a year. I can't afford to give $50,000 a year. Would you pray for me? And Dr. Marshall said, absolutely. You mind if I pray right now? And the man said, absolutely. And so Peter Marshall bowed his head with this man and he said, Lord, I pray for my friend who can't afford to give today. And so I pray that you would reduce his salary from $500,000 back to $20,000 so that he can afford to give. You see, his problem was not an income problem. His problem was a lifestyle problem. And that is so true of so many Americans. And I want to encourage you to change your mindset, to live with a new normal of generosity. And it's not an income problem, it's a generosity problem. So I want to encourage you today to simplify your living so that you can multiply your giving. Father, we thank you for your word today. We thank you for how applicable it is to our lives. And God, I pray that you would challenge our mindset to live with contentment, to live in generosity, to live with a new normal so that we can experience true life and experience what it means to live with financial margin. And so instruct us, correct us, encourage us to be the people that you've desired us to be. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks for joining us today and can't wait to see you soon.